Hello, kindred spirits. So today I'm going to share with you the making of this beautiful house dress. This is the first everyday dress I've made, and I'm really excited to share the process of making it with you. This is actually going to be a two-parter. This first video will be how to make the bodice, and then there'll be a second video on the skirt. I designed this dress with the help of some of my Edwardian pattern books. I chose this beautiful lightweight cotton for the dress. I intended it for both winter and summer wear, so I wanted to choose something that would be comfy for the summer and lightweight enough not to be super sweaty or uncomfortable, but I could also layer up for the winter. So the first step of any garment making is to wash your fabric. I always wash it in hot water so it will do the maximum shrinking. I don't want to have any problems once I've already made the garment or when I go to wash it with any shrinking, so I try to shrink the fabric the maximum that it will beforehand. And then I trim off all of the little bits of fraying on the edges and press it out, and then we can begin putting down the pattern and tracing out our pattern pieces. So normally I would double up my fabric so I can cut two pieces at once while I'm tracing out all the pattern pieces. For this, because there is a pattern to the fabric, I actually did each one individually because I wanted to make sure that I had all of the patterns lined up the way I wanted them to, and they all aligned with each other in a correct way, and it wasn't going to look wonky once sewn together. It's always something to consider with fabric when you're choosing fabric to know if it has a nap, so like velvet goes one way, so if you misalign the nap it's going to have two different colors. Sometimes satin has this, as well as if you're using a really decorative pattern, it also may only go one way, so it's just something to think about when you're choosing fabric on how you're going to align the pieces, because it sometimes may mean you need to buy more fabric. So once I had all the pieces cut out, I pinned them together and I ran gathering stitches for the front and back yoke. My intention with this is to sew it with very large stitches so that basically it's a staying stitch, but I can put it on my mannequin and do any tucks or taking in that I need to. Sometimes I do mock-ups, but with this one I just decided that I was going to cut the patterns a little bit large and take in where needed. So here you can see I've put it on my mannequin and I've actually pinned out where the tucks are going to go, but also adjusted the sides. They were a little too large, so I had to take them in, as well as I think I also had to adjust the shoulders a tiny bit. But that's why I did the staying stitches, so I could just rip out the staying stitches and stitch a new line where I had adjusted them to. So once I stitched the bodice with the final lines that I had marked out, I press everything, and then I didn't film this part, but I also ran all those seams that I just finalized through my serger so that they were all really strong seams. This isn't really 100% necessary. I mean, you could pink your seams if you wanted. If it's cotton, it's not 100% necessary. If you have a overlocking stitch on your machine, that's something you can do too, but this again isn't 100% necessary. You could just leave them raw and it would be fine. A lot of this garment wasn't exactly fully measured out beforehand, and I kind of eyeballed it a lot. That's why I left it large to begin with. So the next step I did was just pressing where I wanted the plackets in front to be and then tacking them down so that they would lay flat as I put on the waistband. A lot of this pattern was just based on what my needs were, and the great thing about if you're going to make something like this yourself is when you get to something like the waistband, because it's just a rectangle, you can make it as wide and as long as you want it to be. For example, I decided to go for the full length of the shirt with the plackets taken out, rather than taking the tucks first and then having the tucks set into the waist. I just wanted a little extra room, so I did the tucks a little bit differently, which I'll show you in a minute. The waistband was pretty quick. I pinned it and sewed it, and then you're going to see I just pinked the raw edges that were going to be enclosed once I finished the waistband, and then I turned it over, tucked in the seam allowance, and I think I hand sewed this, but it honestly could have just got run through the sewing machine. It was just a self-choice that I wanted to hand sew the waistband shut. The way I secured my tucks was by taking a piece of grosgrain ribbon and sewing in a rectangle around the grosgrain ribbon to secure my gathers to it. It's pretty simple and easy, and it gets a desired effect without a lot of effort. Often collars and sleeves can be kind of finicky for people, but I'm hoping that some of the tips and tricks I use here can make it a bit simpler for you. One thing I do to make it simpler to do the collar is I make sure that the amount of seam allowance I have is quite a bit greater than I actually need. That way I have room if the fabric is not wanting to cooperate or something's not lining up. I don't have to struggle with it as much. I'm always pressing well to make sure everything has nice creased seams. The other thing I do is clip into the seams, making sure that everything can move smoothly. This collar consists of the inside and outside fabric as well as a stiffener in between. When you first make this collar, it's going to be very, very stiff, but once you throw it in the wash, it will soften up quite a bit and it won't be as stiff or as uncomfortable to wear. But having a stiffener does make it easier while you're handling the fabric to sew. I pin the collar to one side of the shirt and then sew it by machine. And when I turn the collar over, I press the seams up into the collar and then sandwich the collar around the shirt. That way I can hand stitch it closed and it has a nice smooth seam, and sometimes I'll even do a machine stitch all the way around the collar at the very end. So here you can see, as I said, I'm pushing the seam allowance up into the collar so I can sandwich it between the two halves of the fabric of the collar and do an invisible stitch to close up the collar. It's important to note that while you're both sewing as well as pressing, you should be holding the collar into a rounded shape the way it's going to fit around your neck. This helps the fabric to sit in the position that it's going to once it's on your body. If you don't do this, sometimes you get really weird ripples in the fabric and it's not going to lay as smoothly or as neatly as you might like. Here I'm pinning out the collar to get it ready to close it up. You can see even while I'm just pinning, I'm still holding it at a curve to make sure that there's no bubbling. I'm also not just pinning where I'm going to close up, but I'm pinning along the top, and then I also put pins in the middle running along the collar as well to make sure that every step of the way of that collar is secured and there's not going to be any weird ripples at the end. This just helps with some frustration. Yes, it does take a little bit more time to do all that pinning, but the end result means that I'm going to be happier and I'm going to be less frustrated while I'm sewing if I see any weird bubbles forming. This makes sure that I don't have to do as much holding while I'm doing the hand stitching. I often wish I had 3 to 4 pairs of hands while I'm doing things like this because it's just so much pressing and holding in different positions and wanting things to be taut. There are antique sewing like clamps, but I have yet to get one. So here you can see the finished collar and it's laying nice and smooth and there's no weird ripples. It looks excellent. I'm very happy with how that came out. We're nearing the end of the project, but the last thing we have to do is the sleeves, and this is often the part that people struggle with. I struggle with just the amount of work that just goes into sleeves alone. Often it feels like sleeves should be really quick and easy, but they never ever are. For this sleeve, I decided to do a cuff that's completely enclosed without any opening or closures. This is mainly because it's a work dress and I'm just going to be shoving it up onto my upper arms to hold it out of the way while I'm working. Also, I intend for this dress to be more of a around the house working dress rather than a very fancy dress. It's meant to get dirty and to be around the house where I'm doing chores and other stuff like that where I'm bound to get it messed up. I already wore this to a family event and got cooking grease on the bottom of the skirt, so well on my way to messing this up. So the first thing I did was I ran a gathering line around the wrist and gathered it into the cuff. Then I'm just going to sew around the cuff and press the other side of the cuff down and stitch it closed. I have the cuff inside the sleeve as I'm gathering the sleeve into the cuff. I'm making sure to pin it really well as I am going to put it around the sewing arm of the sewing machine, and I don't want anything to slip as I'm sewing on the machine. As you can see, there's what feels like 1,000 pins holding this cuff to the sleeve, but well worth it in the end to make sure that it saves me time and nothing slips and I don't have to redo anything. Once one side of the cuff is sewn onto the sleeve, I'm once again pressing all of the seams to make sure I get a really crisp finish. Then I'm pressing the seam allowance up into the cuff so that the two sides of the cuff will sandwich the seam. I'm using one of my ironing hams. I'm not sure that's the technical term for this one, but it's the arm ironing ham I have. You can see it right there to get a nice crisp line and make sure that everything is sitting correctly. Here I've turned the cuff so the wrong sides are together and I'm getting ready to press it so that we can close it up and finish the cuff off. This is a lot of finicky finger pressing and a little bit of iron pressing to help me along the way. The reason why I take so much time on this is because I know the cuffs are going to really bother me if they're lumpy or anything is uncomfortable, so I want to make sure that it has a really nice finish and I'm comfortable in my own clothes, as well as I tend to be pretty nitpicky about finish. I chose to hand stitch shut the cuffs when I was finishing them off, but that wouldn't be 100% necessary, and you could definitely just run it through the machine as well. We're almost done with the bodice now. All we need to do is attach the sleeves to the rest of the shirt. First, I need to run a gathering line. Again, I'm doing this by hand. I did try to do it with the machine and it ended up snapping, which annoyed me, so I just ran it by hand instead. Usually, with most patterns that are pre-made, you don't have to do all this finicky matching up. Setting in sleeves, it shows where they're supposed to line up. You sew them together and you're good. But because I made this myself and I knew that the fit was a little wonky, I had a little bit of extra steps in doing some staying stitches and then realigning things afterwards. Actually, what was nice was I only had to fix one sleeve. One sleeve came out perfect and it didn't need any fixing, and the other one needed to come in only by, I think it was like 1/4 of an inch or so. So it wasn't a lot, but it still needed a little bit of retouching. When I'm sewing the sleeves in, I just make sure to go really slow. I have everything pinned really well, so I just try to take my time and be patient with the process, and everything will come out nice in the end. Another thing that really helps with sleeves to make sure that they have a good finish is, as most of my other shirts have, I put in gussets. I'm uncomfortable with having a tight sleeve right up under my armhole, as a lot of the historical shirts have, so I put in gussets to make it more comfortable for myself to wear, as well as the fitting process for the arm is a lot easier if you have an underarm gusset. The other thing to remember when setting in a sleeve, especially a historical one, is our modern sleeves are straight down tubes, but for historical ones they often have a curve. So it's important to remember that they're not set in straight up and down. To finish off, I run the seam of the arm through the serger to make sure that those seams are going to be really strong and well lasting. I did this to all my seams seam allowance that I hadn't sandwiched between other pieces of fabric, so any of my non-enclosed seams got run through the serger. When I say seams, I do mean seam allowance. I think I've misspoken several times, but I just mean that I'm running through any of the extra fabric to bind off and make sure that it doesn't unravel. Alright, so the bodice is going to go in the wash to get all of its marks from the fabric marker I was using cleared up while I start on the skirt. And I will see you in the next video when we start on the skirt and we look at the process of making that, which, to be fair, is a lot easier than the bodice. The bodice had a lot more steps to it. And until I see you next time, my friends, happy sewing!